the American Task Force on Palestine presents Palestine-Israel 101, The Conflict.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ziad Asali, President of the American Task Force on Palestine. The Task Force is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization dedicated to bringing about lasting peace and stability in the Middle East by establishing the State of Palestine alongside Israel. It is my pleasure to introduce the former White House Chief of Staff and three-time Governor of New Hampshire, the Honorable John Sununu.
Hello, I'm John Sununu, and welcome to Part 1 of Palestine-Israel 101, an introduction to the issues behind the conflict and the hopes for a resolution to this critical Middle East dilemma. Palestine-Israel 101 should give you a good idea of what is happening in the Middle East and the best options we have for peace. Our program consists of two parts. This is Part 1, the conflict. We'll give you some background on the situation, show you the geography of the Middle East, go over some of the history of the region, and explore the reasons for the fighting. In Part 2, A Path to Resolution, we'll compare the demographics of both Israel and Palestine. We'll look at what peace could mean to the two peoples, as well as the benefits it will bring to the United States. We'll explore the strong support that peace has, discuss the two-state solution, visualize what peace will look like, and examine a few of the challenges that must be overcome to get there.
We all know that something is happening in the Middle East. We see and hear about it every day on the news. But what exactly is going on there? What's all the fighting and disagreement about? And is there any chance that everybody could just get along and work something out? Well, first off, to understand what's going on, we need to know where this is all happening and who is involved. Let's start with where the Middle East is. Here's the big picture. There's Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Here's the Mediterranean Sea, and all the way on the east side of the Mediterranean Sea is the Middle East.
Now, here in the Middle East, some of the names have changed over the years, but here's the general lay of the land.
Okay, here's the Mediterranean Sea, and here's the historic area of Palestine. The Jordan River is here. Up here is Lebanon, then Syria, Jordan, and Egypt is around here. Now, as things stand today, here's the state of Israel, and here's the occupied Palestinian territories. Guess what? This whole area right here is only about the size of New Jersey. One more thing. The area of the Middle East we'll be looking at is sometimes known as the Holy Land because of the deep spiritual connection many religions have with the area.
Who are the major players in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, Israelis and Palestinians. Kind of makes sense. But what is an Israeli? What is a Palestinian?
Can you tell the difference between Palestinians and Israelis just by looking at them? Not necessarily. There are common features that many Palestinians and Israelis share.
Okay, let's break things down a bit. Who or what is an Israeli? Well, an Israeli is a citizen of the modern-day state of Israel. A large majority of Israeli citizens are Jews, although about 20% are Muslims and Christians. Now let's check out the Palestinians. Broadly speaking, a Palestinian is someone who lives in Palestine, used to live in Palestine, or has Palestinian heritage. Let's go a bit deeper into things. Palestinians are also Arabs. Arabs are a group of people who have a couple of things in common. Basically, they speak the Arabic language, and most of them practice the religion of Islam. Followers of Islam are known as Muslims.
What are the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting about? Well, a lot of it is about land. But to really understand things, let's take a quick trip through history.
All sorts of people have been living in this area for thousands of years.
Israelis and Jews around the world view themselves as descendants of the biblical Jews, known as the Hebrews. Palestinians see themselves as descendants of all the ancient peoples of the area, including the Hebrews, Canaanites, Philistines, and many others. Jews trace the beginning of their diaspora to AD 70, which we can also call 70 CE, where the CE stands for Common Era. Anyway, in the year 70, the Romans destroyed what was known as the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Now, around the 1500s, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. This empire had its base in modern-day Turkey, which is north and west of Palestine. So for about 400 years, the Ottomans had control of Palestine. Let's fast forward up to World War I, which broke out in 1914. You know what? Almost everyone agrees that, up to this point, there is almost no conflict between Jews and Palestinians. Now, let's take a look at something called Zionism, which sprung up during the 1800s. Zionism came about in large part because of Europe's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the hostility toward or prejudice against Jews or Judaism. So, what is Zionism? Zionism is the idea that the Jewish people should have a national home of their own, preferably in the Middle East. People who follow this idea are called Zionists.
The Jews lived in the Middle East thousands of years ago and trace much of their heritage to this area. So the Zionists felt that the Jews should be able to return to this area and set up a national home.
Anyway, things were looking pretty bad for the Ottomans leading up to World War I. They had a lot of competition in the area from other major world powers. For instance, the British Empire.
During this war, the British issued a letter of support for establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. This letter is known as the Balfour Declaration, after the British Lord Balfour, who wrote the letter.
Here's what the letter says. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
Now, after World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled and Britain was given control over Palestine.
In 1922, the League of Nations, a forerunner of today's United Nations, approved a British mandate for the area.
Guess what? At that time, the country of Palestine was 90% Arab. But the Balfour Declaration led to a lot of Jewish immigration to Palestine over the years, particularly from Europe, where they were increasingly persecuted by Hitler and the Nazis.
Now let's move up to World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945.
Up till this time, there was a lot of jockeying for position going on by different countries, powers, and interests. What would happen to Palestine after the war? Would it be an independent state? Would there be a Jewish national home in Palestine? And what about Jerusalem? Who would get that? During the war, a group was formed, known as the Arab League. The League included the countries of Syria, Transjordan, now known as Jordan, Egypt, and others. Among other things, the Arab League helped the Palestinian Arabs in their struggle for independence. After World War II, the British turned Palestine over to the United Nations. In 1947, the UN resolved to partition the country into two states. Roughly 57% of Palestine was to become a Jewish state, while the remaining 43% was to become a Palestinian Arab state.
Now, the Palestinians rejected that plan for a couple of reasons.
First, the Palestinians amounted to about 65% of the population. Second, Jewish land ownership amounted to just 7% of the land of Palestine. The Jewish settlers accepted this UN proposal to partition Palestine into two states. The Arab League declared the partition illegal.
There was a lot of violence in Palestine during this time, and many Palestinians left the area because of the violence. Many others were forcibly expelled.
On May 14, 1948, the Jewish settlers declared the creation of the State of Israel, without defining its borders.
Well, war immediately broke out between the new state of Israel and several surrounding Arab states. Here's the upshot of how everything turned out. When the fighting ended in 1949, Israel had expanded to encompass nearly 78% of Palestine. And the remaining 22% of Palestine? Well, here's the West Bank, which is called that because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. The West Bank was controlled by the country of Jordan. Down here is what's known as the Gaza Strip, which ended up in the hands of Egypt.
Tensions were always fairly high between Israel and its neighbors, and war has broken out a few times. The next major event is the Six-Day War of 1967, which has had a huge effect on the way the Middle East looks today.
On June 4th, 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack on its Arab neighbors, claiming that the Arab countries were on the brink of invading Israel. The Arab states have denied this. As a result, Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, including the Old City, and the Gaza Strip. That means they had 100% control of the historical land of Palestine.
And in a general way, that's the way things have been ever since. Israel controls the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, also known as the occupied territories, home to 3.7 million Palestinians.
Since 1967, a lot of illegal Israeli settlements have been built on Palestinian land in the occupied territories, housing more than 400,000 Jewish settlers. And ever since 1967, there's been a lot of conflict, fighting, death, and destruction on both sides. There was a war in 1973, and two intifadas, Palestinian uprisings, one that began in 1887 and one that began in 2000. And that puts us into the 21st century. There have been many attempts at resolving the conflicts, and we'll discuss the prospects for peace in part 2 of our show.
We can learn a lot by recognizing that there are two different stories arising from this conflict, a narrative that each side carries with it.
For Palestinians, this is anxiety caused by the displacement by Jewish immigration into Palestine in the 20th century, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem since 1967, and their desire for freedom and independence in the Holy Land.
What does this mean for the Israelis?
Well, there's been a long history of Jewish persecution, and in the middle of the 20th century, there was the Holocaust, in which millions of Jews were murdered. So for Jews, Israel is a safe haven, and they have a spiritual connection to the Holy Land.
And that brings us just about to the end of Palestine-Israel 101, Part 1, Conflict. We've given you an introduction to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, shown you the geography of this part of the Middle East, explained who is involved in the conflict, and taught you some history of the region and of the conflict.
And as far as peace is concerned, the general international consensus is a two-state solution, the State of Israel and the State of Palestine, which should be formed out of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem.
Will it work? Can peace come about? What does peace look like? And what will be the benefits of peace to the Middle East and to the United States? Find out in Palestine-Israel 101, Part 2, A Path to Resolution.
The American Task Force on Palestine presents Palestine-Israel 101, Part 2, Resolution.
In Part 1, Conflict, we gave you some background on the situation, showed you the geography of the Middle East, went over some of the history of the region, and explored the reasons for the conflict. In Part 2, A Path to Resolution, we'll compare the demographics of both Israel and Palestine. We'll look at what peace could mean to the two peoples, as well as the benefits it will bring to the United States. We'll explore the strong support that peace has, discuss the two-state solution, visualize what peace will look like, and examine a few of the challenges that must be overcome to get there.
We'd like to take a moment to remind you of the Palestinian and Israeli narratives. First, the Palestinians, who are the descendants of the people who have lived in the land of Palestine since ancient times. The land of Palestine has deep spiritual significance for both Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians.
Jewish immigration that began in the 20th century led to the beginning of the Palestinians' dispossession of their lands, culminating in the Nakba, or catastrophe of 1948, and the scattering of Palestinians in refugee camps in the ensuing diaspora. This has resulted in a deep-seated fear of permanent loss of statehood and freedom for the Palestinians. The Israeli military occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, where 3.7 million Palestinians live, has been ongoing since 1967.
Jews, descendants of the ancient Israelites, also have a long spiritual connection to the Holy Land. Their history is one of persecution, ghettos, and violent acts against them, culminating in the Holocaust, when Nazi Germany murdered 6 million Jews. Israel is regarded as the Jewish safe haven, where they never again have to rely on others to defend their existence and heritage.
Now let's do a little comparing and contrasting of Israel and Palestine. Remember that Israel is an independent country, and as of now, the area of Palestine does not exist as a country yet. First, the makeup of Israel. Its population is about 80% Israeli Jews and about 20% Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Now, the occupied Palestinian territories. It's 91% Palestinians and 9% Jewish settlers, that is, Israelis who have settled in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Gaza Strip since 1967.
Let's look at some economic figures for each. Israel has a gross domestic product, or GDP, of around $120 billion. Palestine's GDP is about $2.5 billion. The per capita income in Israel is $19,500, whereas Palestine's is merely $700. That means that the average Palestinian has to work 28 years to make what the average Israeli makes in 1 year.
Moving on, Israel's annual budget is about $45 billion. Palestine's is just $1.2 billion. The unemployment rate in Israel is 10%. In Palestine, it's 50%. The economies of Israel and Palestine both have had negative growth rates during periods of conflict.
Now let's look at the two militaries. Israel has approximately 4,000 main battle tanks and 450 combat aircraft. Palestine has no tanks and no combat aircraft.
In total, just under 10 million people live in the land between the Jordan River on the east and the Mediterranean Sea. It's about 9.8 million people now. Percentage-wise, the area is about 50% Jewish and 50% Arab. There are 3.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and 6.1 million people in Israel, which includes 1.2 million Palestinian Arabs who are Israeli citizens.
And the most sobering statistic of them all, in the 4-year period between 2000 and 2004, this conflict took more than 4,500 lives. Almost 1,000 Israelis and over 3,500 Palestinians have been killed. The vast majority on both sides were innocent civilians.
Certainly, something needs to be done to stop this bloodshed. Peace is necessary, and in addition to allowing Israelis and Palestinians to live normal lives, peace is imperative to U.S. national interests.
Why is it so important that the United States work to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Quite frankly, it's the one thing that would without a doubt improve our relations with the Arab and Muslim worlds.
Take a look at a recent opinion poll of one key U.S. ally. In Jordan, which is just east of Israel and Palestine, citizens' positive view of the U.S. has dropped by 80% in just 3 years. Today, only about 5% of Jordanians look favorably on the U.S. Results in other key ally states like Egypt were even worse. Every survey and study suggests that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lies at the heart of this negative view.
Current U.S. policy towards Israel and the Palestinians is not perceived to be fair and balanced. It seems that most Muslims believe that the United States sides unfairly with Israel and against the Palestinian people. Check out the percentage of people that think that is true, broken down by country. In Morocco, 94% of the population thinks the U.S. unfairly favors Israel. Lebanon, 90%. And look at important European allies. 56% of the population of France thinks the U.S. unfairly favors Israel. In Germany, 56%. And even 47% of Israelis think their country is unfairly favored by the U.S.
Again, it seems the one thing the U.S. could do to counter anti-American emotions in the Arab and Muslim world is to help resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
According to former White House counterterrorism chief Richard Clarke, quote, "If we could achieve a Middle East peace, much of the popular support for al-Qaeda and much of the hatred for America would evaporate overnight," unquote. He's worked under 4 different presidential administrations, so he has quite a bit of experience and expertise.
Resolving this conflict would A. Pave the way for democracy in the Middle East, B. Improve America's image in the world, C. Remove a major recruitment tool for terrorists, D. Grant freedom to the Palestinian people, E. Provide security to the Israelis, and F. Open the door to a $1 trillion marketplace for U.S. products and services, thanks to better relations with the Arab world.
You know what? Even though it seems that peace is a hard thing to come by, the overwhelming majority of people worldwide support peace, finding a solution and resolving the conflict. Let's look at what Americans, Palestinians, and Israelis think.
American public opinion. Nearly 9 out of 10 Americans believe that a peaceful solution to the conflict is an important foreign policy goal. 64% of Americans think the U.S. should be more even-handed in its policy in order to combat international terrorism.
Palestinian public opinion. 85% support a mutual ending of all violence, and more than 75% support or strongly support reconciliation with Israel on the basis of a two-state solution.
Israeli public opinion. 59% of Jewish Israelis support a withdrawal from most of the occupied territories and dismantling most of the settlements in those occupied territories.
Well, despite the years and years of conflict, strife, death, destruction, and disagreement, there is a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The solution, for which there is a broad international consensus, is for the establishment of a state of Palestine alongside Israel in peace.
The Palestinian state would be formed on the 22% of historic Palestine known as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Its capital would be in Arab East Jerusalem.
This means that the borders of Israel and Palestine would be based on the pre-war 1967 borders. There would be a shared and open Jerusalem as capital for both, and a fair settlement to the Palestinian refugee problem. Israel would be secure within its borders, fully recognized by all the countries in the world, including all of the nearly 24 Arab countries. Peace agreements with each Arab country and a normalization of relations would follow.
And that means an official end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Done. Over. No more.
Israeli and Palestinian views on the two-state solution? A large majority support it. A poll taken by One Voice found that fully 76% of Israelis and Palestinians endorsed a two-state concept, a Palestinian state existing right beside a Jewish state.
And there's official U.S. support for a two-state solution as well. President George W. Bush stated, "Our efforts are guided by a clear vision. We're determined to see two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. So, Israel must freeze settlement activity, help Palestinians build a thriving economy, and ensure that a new Palestinian state is truly viable, with contiguous territory on the West Bank." And Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has said, "We realize that there can be no lasting peace for either side until there is freedom and security for both sides."
The basis for a two-state solution is ending the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The formula for peace and security is for Israel to withdraw from these areas. In 1967, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, which calls for withdrawal of Israel's armed forces from territories occupied in recent conflict.
Such withdrawals have worked in the past. It worked in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, which Israel occupied for 26 years, from 1956 to 1982. It worked in southern Lebanon, which was occupied by Israel for 22 years, from 1978 to 2000. Following both of these withdrawals, attacks virtually ceased.
And it can work in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
How do we get to the reality of two states? So far, there have been many plans to establish a two-state solution. The Bush administration adopted the roadmap. This roadmap was devised by the Quartet, the United States, the United Nations, the Russian Federation, and the European Union.
First off, Israel and Palestine have to recognize each other's right to exist. There has to be a building up of Palestinian institutions. Israel should cease to build settlements in land that will be a part of the future Palestinian state. Also, because Israel's control of the occupied territories has a large impact on the daily lives of Palestinians, Israel should work to improve conditions there. And there needs to be an end to the hostilities between Israel and Palestine. Following the successful Palestinian elections in January 2005, the next steps would include Palestinian institution building and political reform. This process continues. In fact, a donor conference to support Palestinian economic recovery took place in London in February 2005. Next, the process of establishing a Palestinian state would begin, and there would be the promotion of formal recognition of a Palestinian state. For the roadmap to work, Palestinian institutions need to be stabilized, and security forces must begin performing effectively. The quartet will hold a second conference to endorse a permanent status resolution in the UN, and the parties will reach final agreement to end the conflict and will address borders, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, and an end to occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security is the answer. But the two-state solution does face serious challenges. We'll look at 4 major challenges.
The major challenges, in no particular order, are 1. The current path of the Israeli barrier in the West Bank. 2. The more than 200 Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. 3. Violence against civilians. And 4. The difficulty in restarting the peace process. We'll look at each in turn. Let's start with the current path of the Israeli barrier in the West Bank. Since April 2002, Israel has been building a large security barrier, part wall, part fence, between itself and the West Bank.
There are several problems with the path of this wall. Primarily, it will unilaterally annex somewhere between 7 and 10% of Palestinian land, resulting in the stranding of tens of thousands of Palestinians between the barrier and the 1967 border. In addition, Israel's West Bank barrier is blocking 10,000 chronically ill Palestinians from access to essential treatment. In fact, 100,000 pregnant women could suffer from the lack of access to health care. It will cut off thousands of Palestinian farmers from their fields, leaving them with no means of support for their families.
By the way, the International Court of Justice at The Hague in the Netherlands has ruled that the path of the barrier in the West Bank is illegal, that it must be torn down, and that compensation must be paid to the Palestinians adversely affected by it.
Challenge number 2, the Israeli settlements. Since the 1967 war, Israel has established more than 200 settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. According to the Geneva Convention, international humanitarian law prohibits an occupying power from transferring citizens from its own territory to the occupied territory. Establishing settlements confiscates land from the local population, which is a violation of their rights.
So the Jewish settlements are illegal, and under international law should be evacuated. To date, Israel has not evacuated these settlements.
Now, there can be some minor modifications to the Israel-Palestine border in the context of one-to-one land swaps.
Around the West Bank, some settlements can be absorbed into Israel in exchange for equal portions of land to be transferred to the new Palestinian state.
Challenge number 3, violence against civilians. It's pretty obvious that violence against civilians has to stop everywhere and by everyone. Over the decades of conflict, and especially during the Second Intifada, Palestinians and Israelis attacked each other often, causing massive loss of life on both sides. Extremist Palestinian groups targeted Israelis through suicide bomb attacks, while Israel has used modern weaponry against civilian areas and has conducted numerous assassinations.
Most Americans have heard about suicide bomb attacks against Israelis. These attacks must stop. But what about violence against Palestinian civilians? There have been more than 3,500 Palestinian civilian deaths since September 2000. That would be equivalent to almost 300,000 Americans. And violence against Palestinian civilians is inextricably related to violence against Israeli citizens. Take a look at this graph. It shows the number of Palestinian and Israeli deaths since September 2000. Almost every increase in Palestinian deaths result in a spike in Israeli deaths. But when Palestinian deaths decrease, Israeli deaths plummet. Look at July 2003 in particular. Violent Palestinian deaths take a nosedive, and at the same time, almost no Israelis were killed.
Violence plainly breeds more violence, but it seems to have brought Israelis no security and Palestinians no closer to freedom. Which brings us to challenge number 4, getting the peace process started again.
Beginning a political process leading to a two-state solution should be a top priority for everyone, including the United States. The steps of this process need to be implemented by both sides for it to be effective.
What does this mean for Israelis? The government of Israel must freeze construction of the wall that is encroaching on Palestinian land. They must completely stop all settlement activity, end targeted assassinations, and remove checkpoints for Palestinians in order to help create the conditions for Palestinians to achieve freedom and independence.
What does this mean for Palestinians? Palestinians must reform their institutions, address corruption, consolidate their security services, and enforce a prompt and effective end to all acts of violence, including incitement.
It looks tough, but remember, peace is possible, and peace is really the only answer.
With peace in the Middle East, we'll have a free Palestine, a secure Israel, and a much stronger America. Palestine, an independent, viable, and unoccupied Palestinian state, fulfills the rights and aspirations of the Palestinian people to live in dignity and freedom. Israel, an Israel with secure and internationally recognized borders, acknowledged by Palestine and other Arab states, will live in peace and prosperity among its neighbors. America. Resolving this conflict will relieve the root cause of hostility in the Arab and Muslim world, strengthen the U.S.'s role as leaders of the international community, pave the way to democracy in the Middle East, and open the door to a $1 trillion marketplace, thanks to better relations with the Arab world.
Okay, let's review. We've explored some of the demographics of both Israel and Palestine. We've looked at what peace could mean to the two peoples, as well as the benefits it will bring to the United States. We've explored the strong support that peace has, discussed the two-state solution, visualized what peace will look like, and examined a few of the challenges to peace in the Middle East.
And that brings us to the end of Palestine-Israel 101, Part 2, Resolution.
If you'd like more information about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, please explore the ATFP website, which contains a wealth of in-depth information and links to other great sources.
We hope that you have learned something from this presentation.
It has been our great pleasure to present to you Palestine-Israel 101.
By working together in the spirit of harmony and understanding, we can bring peace to the Middle East.